So my hope for this meeting is to align the various documents we have for the user experience for 1.3 and for multi-cluster. We have a new document that no one has looked at yet, the Istio multi-cluster operator experience document. And we have the authors here to walk us through that. I wrote this Istio installer experience before the operator CLI document was written, and we should try to align those things. There was also an old multi-cluster proposal, so we should try to go through all of them and see if we can establish a consensus on what features we want in 1.3, how to implement them in the correct way for moving forward. So everyone knows we've had this multi-cluster stuff for a while, and we have great support for the Helm on sort of installing multi-cluster, but we've been sort of lacking in experience for sort of maintaining one. And I'm hoping Jason can talk about that. We also have this new installer with an operator, and we've talked a great deal about its capabilities. Austin has told us all about canarying between multiple Istio versions, but less has been talked about what the simple experience of a user just upgrading is. We really want to get work items in place for the concrete functions that we're going to deliver in 1.3 and 1.4 for these items. Jason, did you want to start and show multi-cluster operator experience, or how should we structure this?
Yes, I can talk through it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Do you want to take control of the sharing and lead it, or should I try to scroll for you?
Why don't you scroll for me? I don't think we need to go through the whole thing. I can just give an overview, and then people can review it offline. So the problem this is trying to solve is there's a lot of different pieces for multi-cluster floating around. There's scripts, there's some active documentation, sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're out of date. It's not easy to set any of this up. And we don't really do a great job of making that. Inherently it's difficult, but we don't do a great job of making it easier. So can we fix that problem? Start to fix that problem by including some multi-cluster support into this operator that is being proposed as the way to manage, install, and upgrade. I think the most important parts of this proposal are the restrictions, prerequisites, and requirements for the 1.3 timeframe. So this is really 2 months. What's the minimal amount that we can do in the operator to have some form of multi-cluster to make some progress? I don't think anybody will be completely satisfied where we end up at that point. There's lots of enhancements or even security improvements that we can make longer term, but just make some incremental progress. Can we come to some minimal agreement, what we think might be viable and doable in the near term? So that's one place. Getting feedback from various groups would be useful. Is what do we think is what do we think is realistic in terms of the requirements and restrictions? So, for example, one point that I don't think we have complete agreement on is the network topology of a multi-cluster setup. Ideally, we could do multi-cloud, multi-network, and stitch everything together. Istio is capable of that, but maybe we don't start there for the minimal version of the operator. Maybe we assume that there's a flat network that already exists, and we just stitch things together on top of that. And then using gateways and things come later. And that there might still be some steps that the user has to run themselves. They might need to replicate some resources across clusters or replicate configuration across clusters. We wouldn't help with that yet. I guess the other important thing to note here is when I say operator, operator could be a server-side controller that's running in a cluster or many clusters. It could also just be a human operator. There's also, in the operator project, they have this notion of a CLI. So there's two forms of that. So there's kind of a template generation form of that CLI, which is a replacement for Helm template, and then there's an installer mode. So really three modes. There's two CLI and one server-side mode for this operator. They'd all operate on the same API and the same conventions, but the mechanism would be different between them. Interestingly, the operator CLI forms could be Istio Cuddle. I think you could make a good argument for that we'd need to work through the details about how we'd actually manage where code lives and the release process. But conceptually, that operator CLI looks very similar to other proposals that this group and have written. I think there's an Istio Cuddle MC doc, there's an Istio Cuddle Meshify doc. I think there's another one that they're all referenced at the bottom of this doc, but we're all kind of trying to do the same thing. We want a command line tool that helps install and upgrade Istio that can support multi-cluster.
I'd also like to see the command line tool show the current state of the multi-cluster, because that's been missing in a lot of the approaches. We have scripts to add and remove clusters, but no script to tell me what clusters are attached and maybe verify the certificates match or something.
Right. So if you were to break down what a controller would do into a few different steps, you'd have it's going to collect information. It's going to observe the state of the world. It's going to do some diff, and then it will actuate against that. You should be able to do the same thing with a CLI tool. You should be able to run a command that says, "Tell me the status," and even maybe diff. Tell me what here's my intent. Tell me how it's different from what's actually installed, and that's kind of roughly what status is. And then we could also have some support to actuate, to fix discrepancies in that diff.
So you'd proposed a status command. So let me scroll to that. Istio control check. Was this the status command?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this troubled me mainly because the spec was specified in a file, and I wasn't sure how that file matched what the cluster was doing.
So this proposal, I think at the top I say this, and maybe I can spell it out. Maybe I didn't make it clear. This is focused on the CLI, so we don't need to persist any of this in a cluster. So your source of truth for your list of clusters, the source of truth for your Istio control plane configuration could all be local. It could be driven, committed to source control, driven through CI/CD. There's variants of this. So if you had the operator running in the cluster, that spec would be a CR. And maybe the cluster YAML would be a CR. And then running Istio Cuddle check would call some service, and it would cross-reference the CRD that a user created. So similar to Kubinject that we have today.
This would be optional here, maybe. If it was not specified, it would look for the CRD, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Istio Cuddle Kubinject today kind of supports this, where you can run everything with local files, but you could also point it at your cluster. You can put it at the in-cluster config map. It might be similar to that. I think that's something that we can. There's lots of options we could add here. So there might be one thing that I took out, for example, was a precondition check. And right now there's just a single check that does everything, and we're assuming we can figure out the right checks to do, but maybe there's some additional precondition checks that we want to perform explicitly. The example that came to mind was verifying that the cluster was set up correctly for webhooks, because we've had a lot of problems in the past where somebody didn't have their networking set up correctly, and they install Istio, and things break, and they say, well, Istio is not working. which is true, Istio isn't working, but the reason that wasn't working was that their cluster was at the wrong version, or that they had set up something incorrectly. So there might be ways to actually deploy a sample webhook, see that everything looks correct, and then remove it. We probably don't want to do that sort of operation every single time somebody runs Istio cuddle check. So
another pre-deployment check for multi-cluster is to make sure that they're under the same root CA.
Yeah, so there's some, depending on how we manage the distribution of either the root CA cert key or the updating the CA list. We might have the operator do that, or we might have that as a separate step. But that's certainly something that you could check, make sure things look consistent across your clusters. Yeah.
I think that would be a great piece of action, because that's like the number one problem that people run into, at least not with this topology, but with the gateway topology, which is being renamed. There's number two problem that people run into is they don't set up their DNS properly, and so their DNS doesn't install correctly. So that would be another check that you added. And what I might suggest is describing the checks you want to add for the various models. That might be helpful.
So for the DNS, are we proposing that when we install Istio, that this Istio DNS is there with the start.global resolving, or how do we propose that that piece gets installed?
So that's part of, there's two different ways to install multi-cluster. You can install with core DNS or without it. And with core DNS, then you get the global resolution. This proposal is about flat networking, not gateways, which require core DNS. But if people were doing core DNS, I think that'd be a great check, because those are the two things that always stump people. They stumped me for ages. It'd be nice to be able to run one command and say, my certs are good, my DNS is good, because after that, everything is good to go. You're good. You're set with routing. And the third check would actually be to run like a pod on each of the clusters and make sure they have connectivity. That would be a really cool third check if you want advanced features. So these are just like brainstorming ideas. I can add them to the doc, Jason, if you like. But
yeah, that would be. I don't know where we can add it and shift it around in the doc, but that's exactly the kind of the spirit of this. I think other people have tried to capture is you should be able to run one or two commands and get pretty far with that. We shouldn't have to send you a one-off script, or have you paste a bunch of bash commands for the common cases anyway.
I completely agree, and we have three models. I'm curious why you want to start with flat networking, because that requires replication of the services and potentially the pods IPs, and that's a real challenge to do correctly. I'm curious why you want to start with that.
I didn't hear the last part of what you said about something with IPs.
Yeah, you have to replicate the services, right, to get IP resolution.
So my understanding is that we don't need to replicate the IPs. We need to replicate the Kubernetes service for DNS.
That's right. That's what I meant. So you
replicate
the service, and then you get a working system. So there's no way currently to do that replication unless somebody has something hiding around that does that. Were you planning for the operator to do that replication, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this goes back to nobody's going to be 100% happy with whatever initial goal we have. I'm not saying what's here is the right one, but it's not perfect. And I think there's going to be some manual steps in the initial version that people are going to have to do. Flat network.
How far are you going to go with the? So there's two models, right? There's one where you replicate the service entries, and then there's another model where you replicate the services themselves. When you replicate the service entries, you don't have to do that. That's a choice. You opt into that. Versus the services, you have to do that. If you don't replicate the services, the system doesn't work. So I'm wondering why you're choosing that first.
Some of this is based on guidance I've gotten from other people that have worked on multi-cluster, and they said that in the short term, it would be better to go with the non-gateway approach. It has more testing. And maybe you can make the argument that for the initial version of this initial multi-cluster support, it's okay to have alpha quality multi-cluster because you're trying to get everything stitched together.
So I think all of the testing that exists for all of the different cases is pretty weak. But saying the gateways is weaker than the others is not really valid. So I don't think that's really a good reason to choose one over another. I know most people actually try the gateways because the flat networking doesn't work for most environments. And the reason is because you need to configure the pod network, and a lot of environments do not allow configuration of the pod network at all. So the pod networks can't overlap in the flat networking model. I mean, these are all things to consider when you're going through the implementations. I just think the gateways would be super easy to implement compared to.
So I also use the gateways exclusively and prefer the gateways. For implementation, the implementer, we may be at the mercy of the implementer on which order he chooses to implement the gateways. For me,
I agree with you, Ed. I totally agree with you.
For this design, though, what I'd like is that the commands work with any technology. So it would be nice if the commands had a, minus type equals gateways, or minus type equals flat, and then if you try something, it just says not implemented in this version of Istio. But the options are all there so that we have made sure we have designed all the CLI options and CRD options, and then that when we're ready to put them in, that we have hooks for them all.
So I completely agree with what Ed just said. Ideally, we shouldn't have to refactor a lot of the API or the CLI to support either mode.
So I think, Jason, what we're after is we don't want to refactor anything. Like any kind of refactor is bad because the CLI becomes an API, and basically what Ed's going through here, I think, is an API review. So.
I don't know if we're at that. Okay. Maybe we're not at that point yet. So my intent of this doc was to get agreement on the scope and work. I mean, maybe we have a follow-up where we actually do like a proper CLI API review of this. But if we can agree on the scope, then that can kind of help focus what commands we support in the initial set.
Well, I was kind of speaking for Ed, but I'll let Ed speak for himself since he's here. Ed, do you have any thoughts on what you're after?
So the CLI should be a good replacement for the documentation. So I didn't have a chance to incorporate this, but I had previously written a document that I linked to sort of down here, a proposal for Istio multi-cluster. And the very first command I came up with was info that just lists, if you're using gateways or if you're using remote control plane, and this is all just napkin quality stuff, but just to tell you sort of what you currently have and to let you see what other things you've connected to already turns out to be super important, because you sit down at an Istio, you're coming from another installation, you're used to one kind, you want to sort of have these initial commands that tell you what you have, maybe link you to the Istio documentation to sort of get you started. For me, that piece is really important. Then the sort of commands to join these control planes, these are great ways to replace the sort of handwritten scripts people have right now. But it makes me nervous when we say, well, Istio is going to do one thing based on how it's configured. Stuff's been generated by Helm and put into pilot for all this stuff, and whether or not we have a Istio DNS to resolve Start@Global and things. but that there's sort of no way to sort of see it here. It would be good if we sort of mapped out the scope for all of our different kinds of networking, and then just implemented our favorite kinds.
Okay. So I don't disagree with any of what you just said. I'm thinking, if we wanted it to have some milestone for the next 2 months. So there's a separate operator MVP. That MVP is single cluster. This was kind of having a separate multi-cluster MVP, or multi-cluster aware MVP in Istio Cuddle or the operator. So what I'm hearing is I have commands now to do the minimal amount to install and check that things look okay. That maybe we need some additional diagnostic, just like an info sort of command as part of that minimal support, either in the operator itself or the multi-cluster part of that. I guess anything with multi-cluster probably requires some notion of a list of clusters. That list could take many forms. So that seems like that would be important to have some formal definition of, even if it's not the final form. But then with those, that's kind of would be like the building blocks, and then we can extend that to support some of these other use cases.
One question for you, Jason. I guess since this is alpha quality, we're not logged into an API. Just a minute, sorry, my delay.
I'm sorry.
We're not locked into an API. So I guess we could accept changes to the API. Maybe we don't have to do an API review. I personally would really like a strong API review before we kind of commit a bunch of code to the repo.
Have a strong what?
API review. Like.
So one thing we could do that we've kind of done Istio Cuddle today, but maybe this is a separate UX effort. We have the experimental command, which captures things that we say we're not going to commit to long term. We could reorganize that into kind of alpha and beta level feature stages. So for this kind of initial work, we could have Istio Cuddle alpha and then have all these commands under there. With the idea that we can do an initial review, and then as we get feedback and we figure things out, we're okay breaking them because it's considered an alpha level feature, although we try not to. And then at the point that we think it's solid enough, we could upgrade it to beta. And at that point, we would really not radically change anything. Or if we did, it would be a long deprecation.
So the beta locks in the API, so.
It would treat the CLI at the same, CLI options would have to go through the same evolutionary alpha, beta.
Sure.
As the APIs themselves.
So I think we
review.
Ed, does that work for you? And I don't think we really need alpha beta because alpha locks in, or beta locks in the APIs, and when we remove their experimental, the APIs are locked in permanently. In my opinion, Ed, is that correct or not correct?
I am happy with almost anything useful living under the Istio control experimental for now. We need more commands. Let's write them and get experience and see if they're good enough to be promoted to the core of Istio Cuddle.
So just one comment. The Istio Cuddle, there may be some overlap between the multi-cluster command and Istio operator command. I'm not sure exactly what that overlap would be, but we may be in a situation where parts of the operator CLI are at a different maturity to the multi-cluster. So I guess we just need some way to be able to manage that.
Yeah, I mean, it's either you could nest everything under MC, and so it's very clear what's a multi-cluster command and what's not, but long term that might be, like everything might be multi-cluster aware at some point, in which case it would feel kind of silly to type MC for all of your commands. So mean,
So I guess that's true for the imperative command, but I think there's also some overlap in the API for multi-cluster.
yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's the part I'm talking about more.
For the Istio control plane API?
Yes.
Well, so, yeah, I mean, we could support multiple parallel versions of the API. So there could be Istio control plane, an alpha version and a beta version. And the alpha version has the multi-cluster support in it. The beta version doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever commands we run, so you could pair that with the Istio cuddle command. So if you do Istio cuddle alpha, then that's going to recognize the alpha APIs. But if you just run Istio cuddle beta and you fed it a alpha level spec, it's going to throw a validation error.
Mm-hmm.
You could pair the two.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good idea.
And it could be experimental as well as just using alpha and beta, since that's what our APIs use. But there's some notion that you can bring things through that evolutionary life cycle and at least catch it as an error, even if it's not.
So actually with experimental, I'm not sure if that's the understanding in Istio users, but among Istio users, but to me, experimental kind of suggests that the feature may or may not go forward. Whereas I think, for example, so I don't know about multi-cluster specifically, but at least for operator CLI, I think we would need something that's alpha, which to me indicates more strongly that this is something that we do intend to release. It's just right now it's in alpha quality.
Yeah, I don't know how we differentiate between the two, because alpha, there's at least with Kubernetes, alpha things get killed.
So there's basically two levels, right? There's alpha, which means we're not committed. There's beta, which means we're committed. Our alpha implementation in Istio cuddle right now is experimental, and that's committed. We've committed to using experimental for alpha features. So I don't see why we would need a beta as well. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, since once you remove the experimental prefix, the command becomes beta naturally, right?
I think it depends on what you're referencing. So if your beta commands are referencing beta APIs, then that might be useful. And I mean, today with Istio, our GA APIs are still called alpha for technical reasons, but eventually we would have APIs in all three stages. And so you might want Istio cuddle or the operator CLI to be aware of that. Certainly between alpha and non-alpha.
Yeah, so I get the alpha beta distinction, but why beta versus release? I mean, when it's released, it's permanent. I get that. Beta basically means it's not going to change.
Yeah, we could probably debate that for a while, what the right breakdown is. And maybe beta doesn't make sense, or maybe beta is an indication of the CLI quality that you shouldn't vote things against it or use it.
I think it's the beta indicates that it's production quality to me. And so, beyond that, I'm not sure what other level there is other than having some kind of SLA, which we don't have. So
in the community repo, it describes exactly what's required for alpha, beta, and stable. And my memory is a little flaky, but I'll try to remember. And I believe that alpha was the API can change and stuff can be deprecated. Beta was the API doesn't change going forward, and it's going to be promoted into stable at some point. Now, this is different from the fact that our CRDs are alpha. I don't know why that is. Probably so everybody doesn't have to change their code immediately, because we're working on the final versions of those. But I think this is a separate discussion, an orthogonal discussion. I don't see why we would need a beta command. I think experimental solves the problem, in my opinion. But it's just me. Ed, do you have any thoughts? Or?
If we feel that some experimental commands are really experimental and might go away, and others are on a track to success. I think it should be sufficient just when you do, Istio cuddle experimental minus help for it to say, afterwards alpha and beta after some of these commands if we feel people are unsure about that. I don't think that changing the subcommand name helps any because it makes everyone change their scripts. Ideally, they should only change their scripts once when we get rid of experimental and graduate a subcommand.
Okay. So for the purpose of this proposal, I think having the experimental distinction is sufficient. I think we agree on that. That we have some freedom to experiment with these commands. I think to Martin's point, we still would have to think through how this works with the operator CLI, whether the operator CLI is Istio cuddle, or we just share code, or we just share APIs. What level of a common, how much do we share between the two? Because it should be complementary, right? You should be able to use the operator and then use Istio cuddle to check the info or the status. It shouldn't complain that it doesn't recognize the API.
Some people have said that the operator, when running on your local machine, is a subcommand of Istio cuddle. Other people have said it's its own command. I don't think that's been fixed in stone. It can either run continuously or it can be run, remotely. I had a different question about the installer and the operator.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I talk about the installer, Costin points out that you can canary Istios. And I was wondering.
Well, hang on. So because that's a separate topic for the.
It's a separate topic, but how does it interact with this? So suppose I have two Istio control planes, or am I able to? Well, obviously I should be able to install these clusters only in one of my two control planes that I'm testing, which means that I could test multi-cluster. I could sort of say, here's my Istio, here's my same Istio with multi-cluster. Does it work both ways? If so, I'm going to go to multi-cluster. Do we have that belief that that will work, or is that too science fiction for the future?
Are you asking short term or long term?
2019, let's say.
I think short term. Well, so if the question was, what's the status of the dual control planes? I think that is the right thing to do. The next question is, will the operator support dual control planes or be dual control plane compatible? I think so, but I'll let Martin comment on that further. And then the third question would be, what does it look like for multi-cluster? I think that I'll let Martin talk about the operator dual control plane.
Sure. Yeah, I can quickly answer that. So yes, it's absolutely intended to be compatible with dual control plane. I think we're really following the lead of Istio installer in this area, and there is definitely a plan there to solidify and just be more explicit about what's involved in the steps required for canary and dual control plane. And Costin is leading that effort, and I think once the steps are more spelled out, we'll just take that on into the operator. But that's our intention to basically support whatever installer decides is the canonical way of supporting dual control plane.
So that's a beautiful vision. I love it. That's what I hope you would say. The multi-cluster stuff is often somewhat symmetric. So when you install something, it maybe things are happening in both clusters, right? So that means that rollback would be expected to happen in both clusters, and that made me confused. It would be good if we could make sure that we agree on what it means to connect two clusters and disconnect them, and make sure that will work if there's dual control planes.
Do you think that the current So the proposed API and CLI that we have today, do you think that that would prohibit that dual control planes with multi-cluster?
I don't, because I'm imagining there being just a minus control plane option to have the namespace, and that all these commands would work with that. So I think that should be perfectly fine. My concern is twofold. First, of course, to test something, I have to take my workload and say, listen, I want you to stop using my single cluster control plane and use the multi-cluster control plane. And then if it doesn't work, I want to roll it back. That is pretty simple. Then I realized what went wrong. I had been using gateways, and I told it to use single multi-cluster, or I had screwed up Istio DNS or some other thing. I then fix it and do it again. And my concern was that some of the things that you do with multi-cluster sort of affect both sides, like re-upping your certificates, and other things only affect one side, and that rollback would be confusing conceptually in that case.
I agree. I guess my question is, do we need to solve that right now?
I don't want to solve it so much as just to have the command line have like optional arguments to show that, just so that I know that we will be able to fit it in without redoing everything.
Okay. So if we don't have, I don't think we realistically can support that for multi-cluster because we don't support it for single cluster. If this is under experimental, we could have some notes here that it should be, some longer term enhancements would be dual control plane aware, and then we'll have to tweak the commands to address that. So maybe we need to put some more time into future proofing the CLI and the APIs. But again, I think if we have some leeway because it's under experimental.
And I guess I have a question. If it is under experimental and you change things, is there really a lot of pain with that? I know people have to change their scripts and stuff, but experimental implies that stuff is going to change, right?
Can you speak up, Stephen?
Sure. So experimental implies that things are going to change. If we put this work under experimental, do we really care if we have a lot of change in there? Pretty much my question.
So if we need to change it, we can change it because it's under experimental.
Right.
But if we put our thinking ahead of time in to make sure that we have for all the things, then there'll be less to change.
But since if we don't know how it's supposed to work, I think that would be a lot easier to do. But there's a lot, in my mind, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of what the final topology would look like, exactly how we would do dual control plane with the operator, sans multi-cluster. So I'm finding it difficult to come up with the right extensible knobs to put in right now. Maybe other people have a better idea about what that should look like, but I personally would prefer to err on the side of not adding anything until we need it, particularly given that things are listed under experimental.
I'm in agreement with you. I think that makes sense to me. But I think we should spend some time as a team figuring out what these commands should be up front, as Ed indicated.
So
what will be a useful process? So actually having like the equivalent of man pages for these and some sample options that we would expect to have available in the next 2 months, and then maybe some things available in the next 5 months.
that would be sufficient for me.
Yeah, I guess where I see the problem is we've got a bunch of different proposals for what the CLI should be, and I'd like to converge those before we end up with 15 different ways to do the same thing. So that would be one objective I would have out of this work up front.
Okay, so would it be, so I can, I don't know if this is doc is the right place to do that, or we can, I'm happy to work with Ed on creating another doc or amending an existing doc and focus in restricting it to the next quarter or two and saying, here's the commands that we think we can actually support in some more details there. It'd be more of a reference than, you know, user guide.
That actually sounds pretty good to me. I think you can just use the stock if you want, or create another one. It's up to you. I just know that there's a bunch of docs out there, and I'd like them to be unified into one doc. Because, you know, we've had this convergence problem before, and it's really painful every single time. So it'd be nice if we could just solve it up front by not having a bunch of different implementations. So if you want to make the canonical version of what the API should be and make it a new doc, I think that would rock. And describe what the commands do in a little more detail. That maybe it's this doc. I don't know. Ed, do you have any ideas or preferences?
Yeah, we should just pour the stuff we like into a good doc and make sure that it covers the cases that the people here are interested in implementing.
Ed, do you want to work on that in this? We can take the CLI naming and structure and make it like a CLI reference and just fill everything in.
That sounds good. This could be like the design doc of the right?
It would be scoped specifically to the 1.3 and maybe 1.4 timeframe. So I think there's additional things that you'd like to see, Ed, but we kind of have to leave those out to see this is what we're actually planning to implement in the near term.
Cool. So, at least from my perspective, from the environments work group, I don't think Costa's there, but I think from the environments work group, that makes sense logically. Ed, you know, leads the usability work group, so you have to comment on the rest of the usability aspect of things. But I think from a strategic point of view, that makes sense, or at least a tactical point of view.
I didn't hear everything you said, Steve, but the part about me leading the group made sense.
Yeah, I said from the environment work group perspective that this work makes sense, but he's taking this doc and making a separate doc. So, but you are responsible for usability, and I think, you know, I want your input here. This is kind of a cross work group effort in my mind.
Right. So
usability.
So what I'm thinking is just this doc with these commands, and then maybe to take, for example, our existing multi-cluster documentation on our website and just seeing if the commands, the new commands would do the job better. So if it took 15 commands before to set up multi-cluster, that it would take up 2. And if we had a completely different set of commands for the gateway approach, that we would take 2, but with different options than it took for the approach that we're doing here. So I just want to make sure that I can sort of write documentation that is almost exactly the same in terms of what the user does, except easier, not harder.
Sounds beautiful, Ed.
I want to make sure that any files like lists of clusters can be persisted in a config map or something, so that if I come in and add a cluster and then I go home and the night shift guy comes on, he can see what the clusters are.
Okay. So so I guess I'm hearing a few things. One would be fleshing out the CLI reference. Another would be going through the exercise of kind of rewriting our Istio.io documentation using the new CLI. And then maybe some additional sample use cases. So the example you mentioned of, I don't know, I want to see the info of the clusters in the mesh, some sample user journeys.
Yeah, I think that would be great, and I think users would be so appreciative if we get this in soon. I think this is exactly what people are expecting and hungry for. I wanted to ask about MCP. We're expecting that to be part of this in this time frame?
Partially. So I think in this time frame, it's whatever we currently support, but documenting it and putting a decent CLI in front of it. So Pilot can get configuration from Galley with MCP, so we can use that. But Pilot getting endpoints from Galley with MCP, I don't think is ready yet. So we might not use that by default. Longer term, yes. I think longer term we'd want to move to MCP to stitch all of these control plane components together. But it's not clear whether when that would land. It's really a separate discussion to have with the environments working group, figure out to plot like a multi-cluster roadmap, figure out when all those dependencies would land and then pull them into the install experience.
Do we think that this particular thing, do we think this can be done without sharing a common
without sharing a common what?
Sorry. Do we think that this will require the passwords to be the same on both clusters, meaning I need a context for all my clusters that I'm going to do this with?
So my assumption was there was a single human/computer operator that would be administering the clusters, or at least have rights to administer parts of the cluster. Maybe they don't have root, but they have privileges to install the control plane and upgrade it.
I want to make sure that if that doesn't happen, that there is a command line way around that. If it's two clusters with different control issues, like different departments on them. And I also wanted to make sure that if we were doing that, if they were in the same frame, that our commands like check would maybe incorporate that. So suppose that these two clusters are doing MCP and it's working great, and then something goes wrong, Galley crashes on one cluster or something. I'd be curious to know if we expect that to show up here, or if this is not live, if it's just showing information that's in CRDs.
So I think there's probably always going to be topologies and cases that we won't be able to support in the operator, certainly in the short and midterm. I would like to, I think in order to make progress and have something that's production ready, focusing on a fewer number of cases and making them work really well might be a good idea. But that means saying no to some things. And saying no doesn't mean that it's not possible. It just means you might have to take some additional manual steps to set things up. I'm not sure where this particular use case falls in that spectrum. I think for the next quarter or two, I was not planning on supporting or developing that use case. If somebody else wants to, then we can work on it. But longer term, I'd like to understand like the use case better and to see is that something that we want to support or that we recommend, and then extend the API and CLI to make that work.
That's fair. And we just maybe in our own internal documentation, stuff like cluster context, we should indicate as that requirement. and that there needs to be a second way to do it in the future. We don't need to implement it or even design it yet, but we need to know that cluster contexts, if it's going to do work on both clusters, or if it's going to even list the clusters from, client-side configuration, that it won't work if you don't have administrative access to the other clusters.
Do you think that's the sort of thing, so one of the action items was to flesh out the CLI reference? Do you think that's a suitable place to document those caveats?
That's exactly the place.
Yeah, so there's still some options that are listed here. Not everything is final. Again, the restrictions and requirements, if people want to chime in on that and say what they think is valuable or not. I've heard feedback from multiple people that gateways would be really good to prioritize. If there's anything else, that please do add it. If you scroll down, one of the open items was how we manage the cluster list. The simplest thing to do is just the list of secrets. In my mind anyway, there's some other options that we could consider longer term. There's a cluster registry API. There's also a Federation v2 API. I don't know the status of those, what their trajectory is in the open source communities, but it's a different way of managing the same list with similar problems that we'd face with the secrets. So I made a recommendation here for what we could start with, but if other people have strong feelings otherwise, I'd like the feedback. And I think there was some other options further down too that we.
Just one quick comment on the secrets. For the gateway model, all you really need is ingress gateway. IPS. Don't need any.
Well, secrets would be. So there's two uses of secrets here. There's the secrets for the operator itself, so that it could potentially install, the control plane in different clusters.
Okay.
So that secret would need broader privileges.
Certificate or the Kubernetes secret.
It would need privilege. So if you install the operator in a single cluster, it needs privileges to create all the different Istio control plane components. So that kube config and the secret list above would need to have that administrative scope. There's an additional list that is used with the flat network, which is what Pilot has access to.
Mm-hmm.
That is just the Pilot's service account.
Okay, and that's
if
part
we
of
do
the above.
Right, and we wouldn't share that cluster list that I showed above. We wouldn't give those secrets to Pilot. The operator would need to generate a separate secret list for Pilot to consume and discover other API servers.
Okay. I mean, I guess the question is, what secrets are we having and where are we storing? We've been through this rabbit hole like a million times, and it's frustrating. What's your take on it?
Well, I say with so if we look forward with MCP, MCP. So what is that? What that means is that in a flat network, Pilot would get service endpoints from remote galleys. So we need a common identity, which you could get through a shared CA. It could then authenticate to remote galleys, but it would need to discover where those remote galleys are. So Pilot's config would be an MCP endpoint for user config, and then a list of MCP endpoints for remote service registries. And then that might be a CRD, or maybe there's a secret, but the contents of the secret is just an MCP address, and there's N number of those secrets. And then that Pilot is no longer consuming kube configs or anything like that.
I think we should talk more about that in the environments work group or the networks work group, because we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to handle these secrets, and really all you need, at least for the gateway approach, is the ingress gateway, and you need, of course, the credentials to access the Kubernetes cluster. You probably need those credentials for the Kubernetes cluster in the flat network model, and then you need the pilot secret replicated across all the clusters. So we have two different kinds of secrets or information that we need, and one of them is not secret, which is the gateway address. That's not really secret. That's public. It should be public.
Right.
So something to think about is how to build that information and store it in a way that makes Ed happy. So.
Well, I think we shouldn't care. The pilot list of secrets is more of an implementation detail that should, I think, go away.
Because of MCP.
Yeah, with MCP, there'd be some other CRD, like a pilot component config, that would tell it or maybe it's mesh config, that would have a list of MCP endpoints.
That's not going to happen in the next 2 quarters, is it?
No, my guess is not. But that should be, from the CLI perspective, as an implementation detail. The CLI could query that list and tell you something's out of sync, but it wouldn't be your multi-cluster list. The list that I described in this doc is the more user-facing list. So if somebody asks the question, what clusters are in my mesh, they could look at that list, and they could provide that list to an operator or CLI of some sort and have that tool provision Istio across those clusters. So it would need broader privileges to do that. And that might be persisted as a CRD as point about being able to query it after the fact, or maybe that's maintained offline because people don't want to commit their kube config credentials all over the place.
So that sounds good. The MCP stuff sounds a little, I think we need to work on that.
Yeah.
And then there's the intermediate certificates for the root that we have to deal with that needs to be stored in some way.
Yeah, so it's at the bottom. There's there was originally an unsorted list of enhancements that we could make. Some of them implementations, some of them different use cases. I then categorized that by subsequent milestones. So I think I have like a 1.4 and a 1.5 timeframe milestones. Yeah, there we go. We can shift those around, what we think is going to land sooner, or what we think is more important. And maybe that's something that the environments working group helps drive what gets prioritized and what gets rolled into the operator sooner.
Yeah, we need to get on the ball there. We'll tackle that, Jason.
Okay.
We're almost done. I had one question about the install and the replication of the CRDs. Do we think that there's any way to use this tool to help an operator move cluster lists around? I've been asking for a command to list the clusters that are available. Can we list them as YAML in a way that they could be applied to another cluster? Like I could mail the output of a command that lists the CRDs to another operator. He could apply it, and then we would be talking together.
I think so.
Would that be one of these three, or would that be a fourth option?
I don't know if that's related to. Well, I guess it's related in the sense that if you had a single operator and a single install CR in one location, then you could dump that to a file in YAML format and then reapply it. Like recreate your cluster, create a testing version of your cluster. If you had the replicated cluster list, option 2, you could create that replicated cluster list through that same mechanism. I don't know if we'd recommend that or not, but I think that's doable. I think that the key there is whatever format. I think it means having some well-defined API for the cluster list. And being able to dump it out either as a list of, if you did a list of Kubernetes secrets, you can put that to a file and you can apply it. same thing with the cluster registry and the Federation v2 API. Some of them require installing the CRD definitions, so the prerequisite step there. But yeah.
Thank you, Jason, for this detailed walkthrough and proposal. I think this is all wonderful. I look forward to collaborating with you on stuff. So that's great. I think we're at the end of our hour. If anyone wants to speak at the next meeting in 2 weeks, let me know. And please put your feedback in the document here and any other ones from this week's agenda. Do we have any final stuff before I end the call? All right. Thank you, everyone.
Folks. Bye.